Okay, we have this neuron. This is a figure that demonstrates the general structure of a neuron. Um, so all neurons in general have a cell body, which is called soma, which is actually the command center of the nerve and contains the nucleus, of course. So that's the cell body of the neuron. Um, but as you know, all neurons are also set up structurally to both send and receive information, and that's the basic function of each neuron. So to send and receive. So how to send information? Neurons usually send information via an axon. This is an axon. Here we have a very long axon. This is the, how neurons send information. Okay, and of course the axon would form presynaptic terminals, either as an axon passes within the axon. We have the in-passant presynaptic axon terminals, and also we have presynaptic axon terminals at the end. But within the axon, and especially at the end of the axon, we have these terminals. That's how neurons send information, by the axon and the presynaptic terminals within the axon and at the end of that. So, is that enough? Let's just look at this. We have this picture that demonstrate also, this is a figure that, okay, to also illustrate a neuron. But here we have some information about the axodendritic, axosomatic, and axonic connections. So, as you can see here, we have the cell body here, the soma, and here we have the dendritic tree, and here we have the axon. Okay. After neurons migrate, we are talking about the migration of the neurons in the development of the nervous system. After they migrate, they form synapses. That's how they connect with each other. But as shown in this figure, synaptic connections can form not just between the axon and dendrites. This, and this is what happened usually, or that's the basic form of connection, which is between the axon and the dendrites. We call that axodendritic connection, like this one, axodendritic. Here we have postsynaptic dendrite between the axo and dendrites. Okay, between the end of the axon and the dendrites of another neuron. And here we have the same thing between the axon and another neuron. This is one form of connection. But we have other forms, like we also have connections between the axon and the soma of other neuron. So that can be called axosomatic. Axosomatic, like this one. So we have the axon, the terminal of one axon terminate to another neuron, but on the soma or the cell body of the other neuron. So we call that axosomatic synapse. We have another form of synapses like axonic, between the axons of two neurons, like this one. This is an axon from another neuron that connect with the axon of this neuron. So this is what I called axonic. Now here we have this. Okay, okay. Let's just repeat that. Okay, here we have the axosomatic. This is an axon of one neuron that connect with the soma of this neuron, which is the cell body of this neuron. So we call it axosomatic synapse. This one and this one and this one. All of these synapses here. We have another type of synapse like this, postsynaptic, which is from this is one axon from another neuron that's not presented here at this picture. With the axon of this neuron, we call it axonic synapses. Okay, but here we call it initial segment because it is within the initial segment, but there will be something like this between the axon of one neuron with the terminal of another neuron. We call it axonic terminal synapse. So, okay, again, so we have axo, which we can call actually the usual, I would say, the axodendritic synapse, like this one, between the axon of one neuron to the dendrites of this neuron. But we have other forms like axosomatic and axonic synapses. So the form of connection here is, we are talking about the anterograde connection from the axon of the first neuron to the dendrite of the second neuron, or the soma, or the axon of the another neuron. But we are still talking about the anterograde form of connection or communication. Okay, we are still here talking about the connection between the neurons, so let's just talk about this diagram. Here we are talking about the classical synaptic neurotransmission, You can see here that in classical synaptic neurotransmission, as we call it, the stimulation of presynaptic neuron, for example, we have more than one type for the I would say the presynaptic neuron to be stimulated at the first place. For example, this neuron would be stimulated by neurotransmission, by light, by drugs, by hormones, by nerve impulse from another neuron. So let's just assume that we have this neuron is stimulated. So this stimulation causes an electrical impulse to be sent to its axon terminals via the axon, of course. So the neuron, so we have we receive the impulse. This is by the dendrites mainly. So we have an integration of the chemical encoding, then to electrical encoding. So we will have this electrical signal by the axon that will be transmitted to the terminal of the axon. So we have signal propagation, then signal transduction to the terminal of this first neuron. Okay, these electrical impulses are then converted into chemical messengers in the terminals here. This is what's called signal transduction. So the electrical impulse would be converted again to chemical messengers. So that would be released to stimulate the receptors of the postsynaptic neuron. This is the postsynaptic neuron. Thus, although communication within the neuron can be electrical, of course, but the communication between the neurons in general is chemical. So the connection within the neuron is electrical, but between neurons is chemical, as we can see here. Let's just take a closer look here to an enlarged synapse. So this is the presynaptic neuron. This is the terminal of the presynaptic neuron, and we have this is a part of the postsynaptic neuron. So this synapse here is enlarged conceptually, of course, to show the specialized structures that enable chemical neurotransmission to occur here. A presynaptic neuron, this is the presynaptic neuron, sends its axon terminals to form synapse, okay, with the postsynaptic neuron. Energy for neurotransmission from presynaptic neuron is provided by mitochondria. We can see it here. chemical neurotransmitters are stored within what? Within these small vesicles, in these small vesicles here, in the terminal of this axon. These vesicles would be ready for release upon firing of the presynaptic neuron. So the synaptic cleft here, which is between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, we have this what's called the presynaptic cleft, this gap between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. What it contains? It contains proteins and scaffolding and molecular forms of synaptic glue. What makes these parts, the presynaptic and the postsynaptic parts, are connected with each other. So these proteins, scaffolding, and the molecular forms, these things form what's called the synaptic glue, and that would of course reinforce the connection between the neurons. Where we can find what is called receptors. Receptors actually are presented both on this side, which is the postsynaptic side, and the presynaptic side. So receptors are present on both sides of the cleft. And of course, these receptors are the key elements of the chemical neurotransmission. And that's what we will talk about all over this part of review. We will talk about the neurotransmitters, receptors, and so on. Okay, I hope that will be enough to demonstrate the what is synapse and how it works. So we have the presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron. We have synaptic vesicles that contain neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters would be ready to be fired and released within the cleft when there is a neural impulse of the presynaptic neuron, and then the neurotransmitters in the cleft would interact with the receptors postsynaptically or even presynaptically. So that's it. That's how things work here.